Hey, I'm Dan from RB Leaguers, and this is Reels on Wheels. Today we're talking about A Streetcar Named Desire. But before I get into it, I want to say thank you for checking out the Reels on Wheels Movie Club. For those of you who don't know what that is, I'm choosing one film a week to watch and dive into. I announced the movie of the week in advance so you can watch too, and I'm hoping to kick off a discussion by sharing my thoughts on the film on Movie Mondays. For more, be sure to check out the links in the description, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the bell for more RB Leaguers and Reels on Wheels. So this week is all about New Orleans, a city unlike any other. It's a city which many words aren't even able to describe. But for now, I'll just stick with vibrant. It starts with the people, then there's the music, the food, and there's so much more. And during our stint there last week, this was our third time visiting New Orleans, one of our favorite places. I was inspired to look into some of the most notable New Orleans films, and there are many titles of note, not surprisingly, related to the Big Easy, including The Big Easy, King Creole, The Princess and the Frog, Interview with a Vampire, and many, many more. So with no shortage of options for this movie of the week, I decided to just go with a film that is widely considered to be one of the best of all time, A Streetcar Named Desire, the original 1951 version. This film received numerous accolades in its time, including 4 Academy Award wins with the Best Actress, Best Supporting Actress, Best Supporting Actor, and is listed on the American Film Institute's Top 100 Movies at number 47. And even though I'd heard of this film and seen it referenced in pop culture, I'd never actually seen it. And now that I have, I can see why it's considered one of the all-time greats, though of course it's not always enjoyable to watch what's playing out on the screen. Directed by Elia Kazan and adapted from the Tennessee Williams Pulitzer Prize-winning play of the same name, A Streetcar Named Desire tells the story of Blanche Dubois, played by Vivian Lee, after moving in with her sister, Stella Kowalski, played by Kim Hunter, and brother-in-law, Stanley Kowalski, played by Marlon Brando in New Orleans. Blanche is a middle-aged school teacher who claims to be on leave from her job due to her nerves and is haunted by the death of her husband when she was younger. Her sister is happy to host her, but the brutish Stan is put off by her high-class mannerisms and he's skeptical of her story. He rummages through Blanche's belongings thinking she's hiding money from them, but Blanche's papers show that the family estate was indeed lost to foreclosure. One night during a poker game, Stanley strikes Stella during a drunken outburst and later pleads with her to forgive him in return, which she does. Blanche wants Stella to leave Stanley for good, but she refuses. Meanwhile, Blanche strikes up a romance with Stanley's more well-mannered friend, Mitch, played by Carl Malden. Months pass and the tension between Blanche and Stanley has grown, and Stanley has been investigating Blanche's past. Mitch and Blanche near the point of an engagement until Stanley finds that Blanche had a history of promiscuity and a relationship with an underage student that actually cost her her teaching job. Stella's upset with Stanley for trying to ruin Blanche's relationship, and then she goes into labor. Mitch confronts Blanche, and their romance ends, and later Stanley returns from the hospital to find Blanche fantasizing about a better future. He antagonizes her before physically attacking her. Blanche is left in a severely disturbed mental state, and it's implied that Stanley actually raped her. Due to these events, Stella has Blanche committed to a mental institution and decides to take her baby and leave Stanley with no intention to return. Overall, this film took me by surprise. Maybe I haven't watched enough older films, so my impression's inaccurate, but I was surprised at how dark it was. We're faced with issues like mental health, domestic violence, suicide, and rape, all in a movie rated PG. In any case, once I settled into exactly what kind of a movie this was going to be, I was able to appreciate the film for many reasons, including the integration of its setting, the standout performances, the brilliant writing, and the character-focused story it told. I'm going to get into each of those in turn, starting with the setting. Like I said, I chose this film for this week in conjunction with our travels to New Orleans. It was fascinating to see how the city was portrayed in this film from 1951. There are some similarities even to the modern day. You feel that hustle and bustle at the very outset of the film when Blanche is flustered and makes her way to the French Quarter. There's people, music, energy all around. It's hectic to her, as it would be for any out-of-town visitor who didn't know what to expect. And it's even like that today, especially the first time you go to New Orleans. It's a really lively city, it's a really exciting place, and you don't always know what to expect. And Blanche's experience in getting to the city for the first time immediately indicates to the audience that our main character is a fish out of water here. She's flustered by her new surroundings, the city, the neighborhood, and her sister's home. Unlike many films where the setting may only be a backdrop and little more, here it is highlighted to help tell the story. And one quote in particular stood out to me. When Blanche is talking to the young boy who comes by before she goes out with Mitch, she speaks wistfully and asks, "Don't you just love those long, rainy afternoons in New Orleans when an hour isn't just an hour, but a little piece of eternity dropped into your hands, and who knows what to do with it?" She's nostalgic. She yearns for more time. She's attracted to his youth and perhaps missing her own. And calling out New Orleans' ability to slow down time helps to convey that. Of course, this is based on a stage play from the 1940s, so there's much more missing from this depiction of the city than what one experiences in reality. Needless to say, this is not a full and accurate representation of the residents of the city of New Orleans, nor the scale of its size, nor the depths of its culture. But it was still great to see how the setting played a real role in the story. And with legendary actors like Vivien Leigh and Marlon Brando, you have to talk about the performances in A Streetcar Named Desire. You can really feel that this movie is based on a play. It's dialogue heavy, and most of the scenes take place in one location in and around the Kowalski home. So the film is anchored by the writing, which I'll get into later, and of course the performances. Ultimately, it's the ensemble's ability to feel truly human as they struggle through complicated, tense, and tragic developments in their relationships that elevates this film. The fact that Vivien Leigh can really act is no secret. She won 2 Academy Awards for Best Actress for her iconic performances as Scarlett O'Hara in Gone with the Wind from 1939, and here as Blanche DuBois. She brought not just talent, but also experience to the role. In fact, she had already played Blanche on stage in London's West End in 1949, so she was familiar with it. And her performance here in the movie version is captivating. Blanche is a complicated character, mixing sincerity, deception, anxiety, instability, despair, hope, and dare I say, desire, among other things. And Leigh is able to deliver all of this in a way that shows us a full picture of her character, where the portrayal could have otherwise felt disjointed and lost. One scene I want to highlight is the final confrontation with Stanley, when she finally confesses the truth about her past. Up until this point, we'd seen her do many things, but she always preserved some part of her act. She had never let down her guard and fully expressed her true self. When she finally revealed her secrets out loud, confirming to Stanley that she did indeed have the sordid past he discovered, you can hear the inflection and tone of her voice change too. She's not wistful anymore. She's dropping that high-class persona, that veneer she had. She's more direct and aggressive, and her face and voice reflect this. Leigh's performance allows the audience to see, feel, and internalize, not just through her words, the dramatic turn of events that unfolds as she confirms Stanley's suspicions, and it also evokes a sense of dread in the audience because we know just how monstrous Stanley can be when provoked, and up until this point, Blanche had used her lies and stories to diffuse at least some of that tension. And that gets us back to Marlon Brando as Stanley. He's not the biggest person in the world, but he's so physically dominant and imposing in every scene here. He totally sells us on at once being charming and crude, being attractive but repulsive. Early on, we, along with Blanche, are drawn in by what I found to be a kind of curious moment of the female gaze. Curious because in so much film, even today, we see the direction dominated by the male gaze on women and not so much the female gaze on men, or the female gaze at all, unfortunately. And this is a film from 1951, so I was pretty surprised that for an old film, it did have this moment. Blanche appears to be quite intrigued by Stanley when he comes home and takes off his sweaty shirt, but she's quickly disillusioned by his thuggish nature, which Brando completely owns. Still, the film's iconic moment where Stanley yells out for Stella after having beaten her only works because the audience can't completely hate Stanley and just cast him aside as simply a monster, serving no other purpose than to antagonize other characters. And it's honestly a bit uncomfortable for that reason, but I think that's part of the point. Brando allows us to sympathize for Stella, not just as a victim of Stanley's physical abuse, but also as a victim of his allure. When she returns to him in that moment, we can see and feel why. Brando also excels at keeping the rage in check and unleashing it in an instant to shock the audience. Early on, when he's rummaging through Blanche's things looking for answers, and she approaches him fishing for compliments, he's just not giving in. He's saying she looks okay, he doesn't fall for that kind of stuff, and he just seems kind of skeptical of her. But then suddenly, he just erupts without warning, and we immediately understand that we have a character who's a volcano. His volatility keeps the audience on their toes. And I do also want to mention both Kim Hunter and Carl Malden, who delivered Oscar-winning performances in their supporting roles, and they are well-deserved accolades. But I won't get into too much more detail here because I think I could go on all day, and I do want to move on to talking about the writing. It's so evident that this is an adaptation of a Pulitzer Prize-winning play. Not only is the story complex, emotional, and distinctly human, but also there were simply moments where I had to step back and appreciate certain lines. One example is the quote I mentioned earlier about New Orleans, where Blanche says, "Don't you just love those long rainy afternoons in New Orleans when an hour isn't just an hour, but a little piece of eternity dropped into your hands, and who knows what to do with it?" Notwithstanding any deeper meaning, this is just beautifully written. Another standout moment was the scene where Blanche recalls the loss of her former husband. When I was 16, she says, I made the discovery, love, all at once and much too completely. It was like you suddenly turned a blinding light on something that had always been half in shadow. That's how it struck the world for me. And when he died and the love was gone, the searchlight which had been turned on the world was turned off again. That just hits hard. The feeling of intense young love and the tragic loss, the sudden and heavy emotions associated with both are expertly conveyed by this writing, and it's that excellent writing that serves the film throughout. And one aspect of the writing is how character-focused it is and how much of a character-focused story this is. The story forces the audience to grapple with issues of family relationships, abuse, mental health, trauma, and more. This movie could simply be described as watching one man torment two women, but that wouldn't really capture the full story. We're watching a character study on individuals who are dealing with different demons in different ways, and I'll discuss a few of the key ones. Stanley is a portrait of toxic masculinity. He's insecure, he takes out his frustrations on his wife and anyone or anything else around him. He's violent, he says he's the king of his castle and can't stand being criticized or spoken to in any way he sees as disrespectful. His famous cries for Stella show that he does fear losing her and seems to even be dependent on her in a way, but that's what makes him so dangerous. He draws her in and deceives her into thinking they are happy, and he even tries to blame Blanche's presence for their marital issues, even though at the core it's his abusive nature that is ruining their marriage. Ultimately, he's just that, an abusive and violent person at his core. And even when he's right, like when he discovers Blanche's lies and her true history, he uses that to tear her down even further, takes advantage of her weak mental state, and worst of all, he rapes her. And in Blanche, we have a person who is desperately trying to run away from her past. She's haunted by it. We see the recurring theme of lights to show that she wants to remain in the shadow of a reality she's crafted for herself for as long as possible. She wants to put a shade on the light in her room. She only goes out in the evenings with Mitch. She says that being in love was like casting a blinding light on the world that went out after her husband's tragic end. And when Mitch finally confronts her, he, or rather the truth, forced her into the light. And it's in this moment and after, when she can no longer hide in the shadows of her half-truths, that she reckons with her actual reality and begins to fully break down. Combined with the trauma inflicted on her by Stanley, she simply can't bear it. Her story is a tragedy. Meanwhile, Stella finally can come to terms with the reality that Stanley can't possibly really love her. Perhaps before she could justify his violence and aggression and return to him if he begged forgiveness and said he loved her and that he was wrong. But how could she possibly do that now that he's done the unforgivable to her sister while she was giving birth to their child, no less? She too was forced to face the reality of her life and finally walk away from Stanley for good. Though I will say that the ending was ambiguous enough, with her simply going upstairs to Eunice's apartment again like she did before that iconic scene where he yells Stella and then she comes down the steps and returns to him. She might still return. The door is open. She goes back up to Eunice's and the movie ends shortly thereafter, implying that she won't return to him, but also sort of leaving it open to interpretation that perhaps she will, and I think that makes the ending even more tragic. Ultimately, A Streetcar Named Desire is definitely a film that stands the test of time. Anchored by brilliant writing and excellent performances, the film tells the tragic story that can transcend generations by asking audiences to grapple with serious issues that are human at their core. And I want to leave you with some questions. First, a couple of questions about our two complicated main characters. First, what's your take on Stanley Kowalski? Is he just a monster, or is there something more going on with his character? And what about Blanche? Do you completely sympathize with her as just a victim of her circumstances, or do you think her actions in any way contributed to her tragic outcome? And one last question, and this is a more general one. Do you think this film is appropriately regarded among the best of all time? Does it deserve that honor after all this time? Like I said, it's listed 47th on AFI's Top 100 list. Obviously, that's not like a definitive list or anything, but I think it indicates that this is obviously a highly regarded film, considered one of the best. Do you agree now that you've seen it? And do you have any other thoughts? Let me know in the comments or at RV Leaguers. We're on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. And I want to say thank you again for checking this out. It was really fun to dive into an older movie, a classic movie, and deal with some of these really complicated issues, even as seen from a prior generation. And be sure to come back next next week when we'll be discussing, as I'm sure you've already guessed, Avengers Endgame. So it's going to be a complete about face in the sense of this week we did a drama, a classic film, black and white. Now we're going to the newest, biggest film possible. It is the movie event, certainly of the year, probably of a very long time. So Avengers Endgame is the film of the week. I'm super excited. I can't wait to get into it. And don't forget to like and subscribe and click that bell for more Reels on Wheels and RV Leaguers adventures. Happy Avengers Week.